thank you, Mary Jane. Thank you, Rotarians. I am so grateful for being invited to join you. And our family particularly has a warm spot for Rotarians. My brother was the recipient of a Rotary scholarship many years ago. And it was a really important opportunity for him. So we're grateful, and for all of the good work that you do around the world. So thank you for that. I am going to tell you a story about a project that began almost 150 years ago in San Francisco. And it's about a group of women who fought sex slavery at the turn of the 20th century. Now, I'm going to share some slides with you. I don't know if you've seen these images before, but some of them are really remarkable. And they come from archives and places all over the Bay Area and really the country. So let me share my screen with you. I've got to make sure that I can do that. Yep, I can do that. That's good. This is a nonfiction book, a true story. And I spent 5 years working at UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library, Stanford Special Collections, the National Archives, and all over the place, tracking down descendants and piecing together the story of the activists involved around the turn of the 20th century. And what I'm hoping is that I'm telling you a story that will surprise you and will inspire you. It certainly inspired me. So let me go to the next slide. The story begins in the 1870s in San Francisco. And I want to set the stage for what the city was like then. Now, cable cars started rumbling up and down the hills in the summer of 1873. The streets are lit by gas lamps. Many of them were cobblestoned, as you see here. There was continual construction in those days in the city of San Francisco. And there was also a tremendous anti-Asian agitation and violence, a bit like today. And much of that was directed at the Chinese. So the gold rush had ended 2 decades earlier, and the Chinese who'd worked the mines and laid the railroad tracks across the West, many of them came to settle in San Francisco when that project was over. San Francisco was really the capital of Chinese America. And San Francisco itself remained a very rough port town with its infamous Barbary Coast Vice District. I love this photograph because it kind of captures perhaps how rough it was in those days. There was a reporter who wrote that, quote, "It was a town of men and taverns and boarding houses and billiard saloons. It was the cussedest place for women." And boy, was it ever. So one of the most cussedest places for women in the city was San Francisco's Chinatown. And in those days, it was a very densely packed ghetto in the heart of the city. And it was centered then, as today, around Portsmouth Square. There were about 12,000 people packed into roughly 8 square blocks. And as this photograph shows, vast majority of those people were men who had left their families back in China. Now, there were a huge number of brothels in Chinatown in response to a demand for sex. And that demand came from both Chinese men and from white men. And the vast majority of girls and women who were living in Chinatown in the 1860s and 1870s, at least according to census takers at the time, were prostitutes. Now, a few of them may have chosen that work, but the vast majority, we believe, and scholars believe, were tricked or sold or forced into it. And please keep in mind that many of those girls were very, very young at the time that they were there. They were 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. Conditions were brutal. Life expectancy was about 4 years. Many of them died very quickly due to either abuse or disease. Now, Congress, of course, had passed the 13th Amendment at the end of the Civil War, and that was aimed at ending the slavery of African Americans. Yet in San Francisco and across the West, really, there were open auctions of Asian girls and women taking place. These were girls who were trafficked by criminal gangs from China. This is a photograph of what was then known as a Chinese slave girl. This comes from Berkeley's Bancroft Library. And the support for trafficking came as well from San Francisco officials, some of whom were taking payoffs from the gangs that were trafficking the girls back and forth across the Pacific. Many people across the West were profiting from this very, very lucrative business of human trafficking. Now, the plight of these trafficked girls and women came to the attention of the wives of missionaries who were working in Chinatown. And these were Christian missionaries. And they held one of their first meetings in a Calvary Presbyterian church, which was then in a newly built location about 6 blocks from Union Square. And the idea that was sparked at that meeting, which was to try to reach out to the girls and women who were trafficked and help them, was way, way ahead of its time. And these women, a small group, rallied supporters who helped them raise enough money to buy what we see in this photograph, which is a pretty substantial safe house. And one of their early backers was Phoebe Apperson Hearst of the Hearst media empire. I guess she would have been the great-grandmother of Will Hearst, who is still so active in California. And so just to circle back, they raised the money to acquire this very large home and to hire staff. And it opened its doors in 1874. And just to give you, Melissa Prandy, could you please mute your phone? Yeah, thank you. And it opened its doors in 1874, 15 years before Hull House in Chicago, which of course was made famous by Jane Addams, probably the most famous social worker in American history. And our own, San Francisco's own safe house operated in that capacity for 7 decades, from the 1870s to the 1930s. Now, the women who ran this home began doing what they called rescue work. And that's a term we probably wouldn't use today. It's not really that politically correct. But this is the iconic photo of the work. And it was almost certainly staged for a newspaper article at the time. And I like to show this photograph because it really shows you how the women assembled a team. They had volunteer lawyers, they worked with law enforcement, they worked with immigration officials, they worked with a policeman. And what you're seeing in this photograph is a policeman who's got a so-called slave girl in his arms, standing at the top, a detective on the ladder, and then the superintendent of the home is looking at us. And standing next to her is her Chinese aide. And this is the person who had the first contact with the trafficked girl because she could speak Chinese and communicate with her. The Chinese staffers at the home were often on the front lines. As I mentioned before, they were the first to speak with the trafficked girls. They worked with translators in court, and they worked with law enforcement officials. The white women really could not have done their work without their Asian colleagues. So this was really a cross-cultural project that was going on. Now, we know through the logbooks and case files that between 2,000 and 3,000 residents stayed at the home in the 70 years that it operated. This is a formal photograph by Louis B. Stellman, which is in the California State Library, of some of those residents. And as you can see from this photograph, they ranged in ages from babies to young children to women in their 20s and their 30s. And some of the babies, of course, were born to residents who had been prostitutes or sex slaves. Others were orphans who were left to the care of the home. This was before there were very many social services in San Francisco. And the women who ran the home hoped to share their Christian faith with the girls and the women who stayed there, although conversion to Christianity was not a requirement for staying at the home. So this is a formal portrait also from the California State Library of this very small band of faith-based activists who ran this home. And these activists were Asian and white, and they fought the slave trade for seven decades together. As anyone who's ever volunteered in a local nonprofit knows, they too were struggling with extremely tight budgets. They never had enough money. Yet it's really remarkable how much they managed to achieve. They testified in front of legislators. They helped pass one of the first pieces of anti-trafficking legislation in the state of California. They hosted an enormous number of VIPs, including a presidential party and the philanthropist Andrew Carnegie and his wife. There would be days when they'd have 4 separate groups of visitors coming to visit the home and see what they were up to. And the person who was the public face of the home was named Donaldina Cameron. And her Scottish family called her Dolly. This is a photograph of her here at age 25, the year that she arrived at the home to teach ostensibly sewing. But she very quickly rolled up her sleeves and got to work. And almost as soon as she got there, there was a threat against the home. One of the criminal Tong members, we think, laid dynamite around the home because, these activists were disrupting their business, and there was a lot of anger directed at the mission home at that time. So Donaldina got to work, and she really became so effective at disrupting the business of human trafficking that her enemies in Chinatown, again, primarily organized crime gangs, they called her the White Devil. And that's where the title of my book comes from, The White Devil's Daughters. And now White Devil, of course, is a racial epithet, and it was meant to scare the girls and prevent them from seeking out Dolly or the safe house. At the same time, some of the girls and women in the home started calling her Lo Mo, which is an affectionate Chinese term, and it means old mother. And they referred to her as their mother, and she referred to them as her daughters. And one of the most touching things I found in the Stanford archives was a folder of Mother's Day cards that girls who had passed through the home over the years sent Dolly on Mother's Day to really thank her for helping them change their lives. So Dolly and her team faced many threats and challenges over the years, including right at the turn of the century, the quarantine of Chinatown because of an outbreak of bubonic plague. But one of the most terrifying is pictured here. This is a photograph that was snapped on the morning of April 18th, 1906, right after the earthquake and before the firestorms really had broken out. And this was a photograph taken by the German photographer Arnold Genthe. And he's standing about 100 feet, maybe 50 feet away from the home. The home is on the left-hand side, looking down on Sacramento Street towards the Embarcadero. And Dolly managed to get every single resident of that home to safety. There were about 50 girls and women living at 920 Sacramento Street at the time of the earthquake. And she managed to get them all on a ferry, get them to Marin County, where they lived for the next few months. Initially in a barn at the San Francisco Theological Seminary in San Anselmo, and then in a small, very cramped small house on Bayview in San Rafael, which is still standing today, by the way. But it was really Dolly's first person account of leading the girls and the women through the destroyed city, an account where I almost could smell the smoke in the air and feel the chaos and feel, how frightened people were. That made me want to tell this story. I grew up in the Bay Area. I was born here, and I never knew the story about this safe house. So I really wanted to learn more. and particularly learn more about the kind of grit and resilience of the girls and women who passed through that home. So I decided to set out and try to find out more about it. And, you know, one of the great delights in telling this story was learning about some of the residents and the really remarkable ways they changed their lives, in large part because of the educational opportunities that the home afforded them. Now, this is a young woman who was among that band of earthquake refugees. She was a young girl when the earthquake first struck. Her name was Tai Lin. And she was sold by her family as a child servant. And she ended up running away to the rescue home at 920 Sacramento Street to avoid an arranged marriage. She got an education at the home, and she became a translator and an aide there. And she eventually became the first Chinese American woman to work at the newly opened Angel Island immigration station. It opened, of course, in 1910. And she fell in love with a fellow worker at Angel Island, a white man. And they went to Washington State to get married. During that period of time in California, there were anti-miscegenation laws, which made it against the law for a Chinese woman to marry a white man. So they went to Washington State, legally got married, came back to California, and they both got canned from their jobs. They lost their jobs, but they were resilient people. They figured out other things to do, other jobs to take. And I'm particularly fond of the photograph of Tai behind the wheels of this car. So this was a photograph that ran in a newspaper. And the caption in the newspaper was, described Tai as a progressive Chinese American woman and the first to cast a vote in a presidential primary. Which is pretty cool. I don't think she probably was absolutely the first Chinese American woman to cast a vote, but she was certainly one of the first. She never did learn to drive, however, and she was very short-statured, which is why she got the nickname Tiny. So again, this was staged for the newspapers, and she never did learn to drive. And one of the great pleasures and joys of this book for me has been getting to meet the descendants of some of the people who came through the home. And I've gotten to know Tai's grandson because PBS American Masters did a short documentary on Tai, and they interviewed both me and her grandson for that. So it's really been fun to get to talk with him and share stories. So the next woman I want to tell you about was named Bei Jing. She too had fled an arranged marriage in China. She ran away to the home at 15, and it quickly became very clear to the staffers at the home that she was very gifted academically. And with their help, she became the first Chinese American woman to graduate from Stanford University in 1927. That's not all. She went on to become a pioneering Chinese American female doctor. And as you can see from this photograph on the right, she came home and she came back to San Francisco after getting her medical degree in LA and helped care for some of the younger residents of the rescue home. And that's such a touching picture. Now, I want to back up and tell you a little bit about this photograph by saying that, you know, one of the challenges of writing this history was that very few women who've been trafficked ever leave written records of their experiences behind. And that was true in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, just as it is true today. So as for a historian like myself, it is a surprise and delight to come across somebody who did leave a record. And that woman went by a number of different names over the years, but we know her now as Yamada Waka. And this is a photograph of her, Yamada Waka. She was a Japanese woman who ended up writing very movingly of her experience of being trafficked. Her story is she was trafficked from Japan through Seattle and then down to San Francisco. She ended up taking refuge at the rescue home at 920 Sacramento Street, right around the turn of the 20th century. and she gained an education there. She ended up marrying the tutor that the women at the home had arranged for her. And the two of them returned to Japan, where Yamada Waka ended up being a leading writer and set up a safe house modeled on 920 Sacramento Street in Japan for vulnerable women. This photograph is remarkable. It's from the US Library of Congress, and it shows Yamada Waka standing in front of the White House in 1937 after she's met with Eleanor Roosevelt. And I'd like to show this photograph because it's really such an example of the role that education can play in changing lives. So now the last person I want to tell you about may be my favorite character of all. And she is one of the girls who came to call Dolly mother. Her name was Tien Fu Wu. She arrived in San Francisco in 1894, about 15 months before Dolly arrived at the safe house. She was sold by her father in China when she was a young girl to pay his gambling debts. And she ended up in a brothel in San Francisco at around the age of 8 years old. Now, she wasn't being sexually abused, but she was a child servant in that brothel. She was being physically abused by her owners, however, and police heard about the abuse that she was suffering. And so they scooped her up and brought her to the safe house. And she really spent her childhood, the rest of her childhood there. She grew up in that house at 920 Sacramento Street. Education, again, played a very key role in her story. Through the women at the home, they found a sponsor for her, and she ended up going to college. And she eventually returned and became Dolly's key aide. So it was Tien who ran the home in Dolly's absence. It was Tien who translated in court and traveled around the country to check up on former residents who married. She was such a wonderful, wonderful character. Now, as I mentioned before, I traveled all over the country myself, and even overseas to do the research for this book. And one of the most moving places I visited was the Cameron family plot in Evergreen Cemetery in Los Angeles. And there's Dolly and there's Tien, and they're in the same plot. And life, they became each other's closest friends, and they spent their last years together. And my book, in one sense, is about their very unusual friendship. They were both immigrants fighting to protect vulnerable women and to help those women gain educations. And these gravestones really are a reminder to us of how close this history is. You know, Dolly only died in 1968, so I was able to interview her nieces and nephews and hear family stories about her. Likewise, the woman who became known to whole generations of people as Auntie Wu, Tien Fu Wu, only died in 1975. So I could interview people who knew her, who would celebrate Chinese New Year's with her, who, you know, got her birthday gifts. They felt very close. And, you know, just so you know, the Cameron family has very strong roots in Marin County. So they shared a whole, literally what do you call it? You know, a big case full of family papers and documents with me that had been sitting there for almost 100 years. So that was pretty cool. So what is 920 Sacramento Street today? Well, it's still there. This is what it looks like. I took this photograph not too long ago. It looks exactly the way that photograph shows. As you probably noticed, there's clinker bricks. It's made out of clinker bricks because this is the rebuilt building after the earthquake. And it's still a very vital social services agency in Chinatown. It, for example, operates a food pantry for folks there and helps with language and all kinds of other stuff, after school counseling, stuff like that. But anyways, you know, for me, this is a story really about how a very small group of people acting on their consciences can bring about changes in literally thousands of people's lives. And that's what happened. So thank you so much for listening. If we have time, I would be absolutely delighted to answer any of your questions. I also wrote the book, The House of Mondavi, about the famous Napa Valley wine family. And I wrote a book called Lost Kingdom about 19th century Hawaiian history, the Kingdom of Hawaii and the Last Queen. Happy to answer questions about that as well. Thank you so much.
Wow, fascinating story, Julia. That must have been very interesting learning all about that and doing that research, huh?
I loved it. Yeah, it was a great opportunity to get to know our community a little bit better.
Right.
Thank
I have
you.
a question, if I may.
Sure.
So Julia, I'm just curious, like in the case of Ty's grandson,
Yep.
did he know a lot of the history, or did you kind of educate him about her, or was it equal? Or I'm just...
He knew as much or more of the history than I did. He and the rest of the family had recently given family papers to one of the libraries at the Bancroft. And so I got early access to that before I knew the grandson. But he knew it in a different way than I knew it. I mean, I knew probably the wider context of Ty's story, his grandmother's story, but he knew the more intimate level of what she was like, what her husband was like, what was it like to be, a couple of a white man and a Chinese woman at a time when there was a lot of prejudice. So
Thanks.
But thanks for asking that question.
Julia, I have a question.
Sure.
So curious about, especially when they first started up, you said, they incurred the wrath of the gangs and all of that. Were any folks harmed because of the gangs? What kind of retribution happened, if any?
Yeah, great question. There were lots of threats. Tai especially was threatened. I remember working in the archives and finding a note that had been written to Tai in Chinese, and then one of the staffers there had translated it, and it described her as a pig who would be gutted, and it was really frightening. So particularly the Chinese aides were a target for the traffickers. But the other thing that was, aside from things like leaving dynamite in front of the house and threatening to grab the girls when they left the house, they always had to be escorted, and the house always had a guard at the front, as well as all of its windows barred to keep traffickers from breaking in. But really the other thing that is so striking and perhaps not surprising was the torrent of legal attacks on the house. I mean, every time that a girl came into the home, or many times a girl came into the home, she was very, very valuable. She was in, $1,900 worth $4,000, which is $100,000 or something today. And so those traffickers would hire generally very well-established white lawyers, and they would be in court, 12 times, 14 times, 18 times trying to get the girls back. So they were, the women who ran that home were relying on mostly volunteer legal help from attorneys in town. To try to ward that off. I suspect it's not very different than the safe houses that are operating today. So, but thank you. That's a great question, Gail.
How about the press, Julia? How was it? How was the house viewed? And I guess at different times maybe it was different. But how was the house viewed by the press? How did they depict it? As a bunch of stupid immigrants, or did they get behind? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I would say this. I would say that the women who ran the house, particularly Dolly, was very savvy with the press. I mean, it's great copy, right? It's made for sensational stories about slave girls being rescued, and the newspapers throughout that time that would assign feature writers to follow these stories. And so certainly that helped with donations. That helped in terms of raising the profile of the project so that maybe law enforcement would be more helpful because they knew that there was a great deal of public scrutiny on that project and that home. There wasn't a lot of criticism of the girls who ended up there, or the young women who took refuge there at all. It was, the coverage was, this is the era of yellow journalism. The focus was on the, heroic Dolly Cameron rescuing poor little slave girls. That's basically how those stories went.
Okay, interesting.
So Julia, how did you get interested in this topic?
Sure. So I got interested in this topic because I was interested in writing a story set in San Francisco. I was originally thinking I would write a biography of the city, inspired by, there's a writer who did a biography of the city of London, which I admire a lot. But I decided instead that it made more sense to focus telling the story of the city through one institution, one house, and one set of characters. And this house was particularly unusual because it stood for such a long period of time. There were great records about it and about the women who passed through it, which is very unusual in San Francisco history, since the 1906 disaster destroyed so many records, but it didn't destroy the records of the safe house. Dolly Cameron had scooped up those records with her when she and the other residents fled to Marin. So, in part, I was probably inspired by the idea of, almost opposite Downton Abbey type of approach, where you just look at the house and who's going in and out of it over all those years. And can you tell a larger story of San Francisco through that one lens, essentially.
Excellent. Anything,
So-
what are you working on now? What are you working on now, Julie? Then we have one more question from Pablo, but what are you working on now?
Sure. So I'm working on a magazine article that may turn into a book about the unsolved murder of one of California and the West's richest women. And there's an effort underway to solve this murder. And it has very strong ties to kind of our contemporary world right now. So I'm working on that. I'm almost done with it. I've got a couple of interns I'm working with, and they're doing fact checking for me. And that's been a fun experience to work with, kind of college, early 20s young journalists.
Can you say which magazine?
Yeah, I'm writing for Alta magazine. That's the new Will Hearst magazine.
Oh, okay.
And it's absolutely wonderful, the kind of stories they're telling. And my particular interest, as you can tell, is in the way that history intersects with our lives today. And there aren't a lot of magazines that are as fascinated by history as I am. So Alta magazine does a really good job with that.
And Pablo?
Thank you. Julia, congratulations on all your work. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
It takes a lot of research to do these things and to be satisfied with what you write. My comment is this. You, maybe a couple of years ago, the district attorney for Marin County came to our club to speak. And she mentioned that Marin County was one of the centers of sex trafficking in the Bay Area. And there are reasons for that, but perhaps that's another research project. But it seems to me that the sex trafficking, which a lot of people are fighting against and trying to prevent it and trying to do this and that in order to protect our children, it doesn't seem to be a project that we can win. It would always exist, and it would be hidden, and we're going to lose some girls and boys because I think that man will never be able to get rid of that problem. And the problem is men, it's not the women. I feel that it's a battle that we're not going to win, especially in other countries. I come from South America, where I know what's going on, and in China it goes on, and Europe, and the United States. Even though we have so many problems, sometimes we don't worry about this sex trafficking. But as I said, it's a non-winning project. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pablo. I think that's such an important point to make, which is that we're still grappling with this issue. And this project in San Francisco was a very early one to even raise awareness of trafficking. And on a slightly more pessimistic or more optimistic note, I would say that there is a great deal more awareness of it now than there was before. However, in the kind of economic times we're in at this moment, I think that there is even more trafficking going on, and it is very hard to control. I've gotten to know contemporary anti-trafficking organizations through this book, and I've learned a lot, and it's very sobering. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, Phyllis,
I was saying something, but I was muted. Yes, Mary Jane, can you please thank Julia?
say thank you, Julia. That was really fascinating. One of the people here in Marin County, Nancy Kelly, did 1,000 Pieces of Gold.
Oh, she's fabulous. I know Nancy.
Yeah.
She's great. That's a great film too.
Yeah, that's for all of you. If you haven't seen it, Google it and watch it. It's called 1,000 Pieces of Gold. Nancy Kelly and Kenji Yamamoto, her husband, did the movie together years ago, and they've redone it and color, et cetera, and it's still a very vital movie.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much. This is really such a fascinating topic.
Thank you.
And the research that you put into this and finding so many sources of information, it's really phenomenal. You said it took you 4 years to put it together?
Took 5 years.
5 years.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you
Yeah.
so much. And where are your books available?
Well, I always encourage people to go to their independent bookstores. So I don't know in Terra Linda where that would be, but Copperfield's, Book Passage. We have, we're blessed with a lot of great independents in Marin County.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We do have a book that we give to the local school. This one is called Library Lion.
Nice.
And your name will be inscribed in there as a donation from your self as a speaker for Rotary. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Terrific. Thank you for
very
the
much,
invitation. Thank you.
It was a great presentation.